Hello, everyone. Welcome to this next installment of a Grace Live Conversation. My name is Mike Sloan. I'm the director of the Safeguarding Initiative at Grace. And I'm very glad to be joined today by my colleague, Jimmy Hinton, who will give a little more, welcome Jimmy, give a little more introduction here in a moment. But our topic today is a very important one, and it's responding well to abuse disclosures. And the purpose of this conversation is for Jimmy and I to share and talk through some of the key aspects of that. And given our experience in the church in this regard and how we've learned over the years and grown in our understanding of what makes a more effective response when abuse is disclosed. I just want to say at the outset, this is a complex topic, and this conversation is not meant to be a comprehensive, covering every aspect of this. But we do hope that we're sharing a few key ideas for churches, whether you're a leader, whether you're just a concerned churchgoer, church member, for effective prevention and response, because ultimately effective response is something that depends upon the entire community. It can't simply be one or two concerned people in the church. Any kind of effective prevention and response in the church is something where we want to see the whole church becoming involved in appropriate ways. And so at the outset, just want to acknowledge this is a very hard issue. It can be complex in terms of some of the details of this. And so we all need to continue to get better training and resources. So our goal is to spend about 45 minutes or so in conversation, and we hope this benefits those of you listening in from your church. Let's go into a little bit more of an introduction. Jimmy, why don't we start with you? Why don't you just give yourself a little more of an introduction and tell the folks listening in a little more about Jimmy.
Yep. So I am Jimmy Hinton. I am a full-time pastor at the Somerset Church of Christ, Somerset, Pennsylvania. Somerset is known for the 9 coal miners that were rescued in 2002, a year after 9/11. And 10 miles up the road from us is Shanksville, where I grew up. And of course, that's the resting place for United 93, the 4th plane that went down on September 11th. I went to seminary from 02 to 07, started full-time ministry at my home congregation in 2009. And then 2 years later, my youngest sister at the age of 20 disclosed that she had been sexually abused by our father. Both my mom and I subsequently made a police report. We reported that immediately. We found out that he not only abused multiple family members, but loads of other victims, and that included victims in my own church up to the time of his arrest. He's currently serving a life sentence in prison. He got a 30 to 60 year sentence back in 2012. And ever since then, I've been researching and training and advocating for victims of abuse.
Great. Thanks, Jimmy.
Yep.
And I'm so glad to have this conversation with you because of all the interaction you have with churches all the time over these issues of response and particularly responding to abuse disclosures. A little bit more of my background, if you're not familiar, for those listening. I also, like Jimmy, went into pastoral ministry I was in 2008, went into pastoral ministry, and early on, I had received some training in abuse prevention and response, and it really opened my eyes. And I saw and started questioning, why wasn't I given more tools or training or resources in seminary? And I saw the real need for this in churches. And so I began to read everything I could get my hands on this, eventually started getting enough education and training myself to advocate and train others. And so while I was a pastor in local churches for nearly 10 years, overlapping with that, now for the last 10 years, I've been training churches, consulting with churches on developing policy and responding effectively to abuse in the local church. So the reason both of us do this work, I believe, is because we as Christians, and we love the church. We want to see the church do so much better, and there is a real need for that. So at the outset, the last thing I'll say before we dive in is just that a lot of what we talk about today is going to be focused on responding to child abuse disclosures. But I did want to mention, we've heard from several folks on social media that there is an interest and a need to continue to discuss other forms of abuse, such as clergy abuse. And so I just want to say that our plan is to address that topic in more detail, more specifically soon. Although some of the things we say today would be applicable to really any form of abuse, but our focus will be on child abuse disclosures. So the last thing I'll say before we dive in is that if you are listening to this and you find yourself just having a hard time staying calm, or feeling anxious, or feel your mind going somewhere, please just step away and take a break and take care of yourself. That's perfectly acceptable. This is being recorded. You can always come back and look at that later on our YouTube channel. So please, in the midst of this, do anything you would need to do to prioritize your own health and self-care. That's absolutely something we should all prioritize. So please do so. All right, Jimmy, let's just start here with a very important question. What difference, what would you say to this? What difference can it make to a victim when that victim is believed in a church setting? Talk about, let's just start the conversation there. What are some of the first things that you would say about that?
Yeah, I think it makes all the difference in the world. I think that's why. Well, first of all, I'm going to say this: when victims disclose abuse, it's not easy.
Right,
It's incredibly difficult because it opens up so many areas of their life that are private,
right.
that are full of shame. Even they have wrongful guilt because the abuser has placed that guilt on their shoulders.
Mhm.
So there's a whole host of reasons why they have trouble reporting it to people. Um, and so, oftentimes we hear victims say, "Well, the way that the church responded was far worse than the abuse." And I try to think about that for a minute, because I hear stories every single day of my life. I mean, in very graphic details about what victims experience at the hands of abusers. I can't, I can't imagine anything that's worse than that kind of abuse. I just can't. My mind can't think of anything that's possibly worse that a child would have to endure. For them to say that the way the church or failed to respond was far worse than the abuse shows how important it is to get it right.
Right.
So, that fortunately was one of the first things that I had told my sister when she disclosed. I said, I believe you. Um, but I think there's another side of that coin too. Uh, Believing somebody is one thing, but actually doing something is quite another. So, victims rarely are telling people just to get this off their chest because
Mhm.
they don't want people to know. And you can't blame them. Uh, Most typically, uh, in the case of an intentional disclosure, they're telling you because they want something to be done so that it stops that abuser from abusing more children.
Right.
That's why they're telling. So it's really important not only to believe but to respond.
Excellent. Yes, that's so key. And one of the things that I'm often talking with churches about is this idea that you mentioned of how hard it is to come forward. And I try to explain it this way. Look, when someone has been violated, and this could be a child, but this could also be an adult violated by a leader in the church, for example. When someone has had a person in power that they trust, who is a spiritual person in their life, a spiritual leader, violate that trust in such an egregious way, just put yourself in the shoes of that victim. We're asking the victim to come forward again to someone in a position of power and trust again, and make themselves vulnerable again.
Hmm.
And how can we minimize what that would take for someone to have the ability to come forward and share about something, like you mentioned, that is so deeply personal and painful? I just don't think churches often have a clue how what we're asking to say, oh, well, why didn't you tell me? With that
Yeah.
victim blaming statement that we give
Yeah.
toward victims. Why didn't you come forward sooner? Why didn't you do this? I mean, all of those things that can do so much damage in response. It is just so vital for churches to think about the experience from the perspective of a victim as much as possible. And we've both talked to survivors, right? Who say, and I've talked to therapists who work with survivors, and they've told me it can be a watershed moment. How you respond. Do you respond with belief? Do you respond with care, with concern? Or do you respond with skepticism? Do you respond with victim blaming? It can be like a watershed moment, either helping someone on a road, a path of healing, or sending them down a path of further harm, of further pain, and even, according to trauma therapists, further re traumatization. So it's just absolutely vital that we begin with
Yeah,
that.
I'm gonna say too,
Yeah,
Mike. I'm gonna throw this in because I think this is
sure.
really important, and this is fresh. I mean,
Yeah,
I'm looking at a site right now. Um, it's not just church leaders who respond really poorly.
right.
It's church members, it's friends, it's
Yes.
family, it's lay church members who attack victims for saying anything. When they speak up, they typically do get attacked from all sides. So here's an article that was posted by the Christian Chronicle yesterday. They interviewed me about a youth minister in the Church of Christ that
Hmm.
he got arrested on multiple statutory rape charges, transporting victims across state lines for the purpose of abusing, on and on and on, like federal charges, you name it.
Right.
So Christian Chronicle posted that article, and here was one of the responses, and there are tons of these kinds of responses. As much as this behavior from a minister is unacceptable, I choose to forgive him and allow him to turn back to the Lord. We as Christians need to be willing to forgive those who have wronged us. If you say you're a Christian and do not believe in forgiveness, then, and this is in all capitals, you are not a real Christian. Mike, this is lunacy. This is the
Yes.
kind of stupid stuff that that really damages survivors, and it's why they don't speak up. You know,
Right.
they get viciously attacked, told that they're not a Christian, told that they're not forgiving. And the post that she was responding to said nothing about forgiveness.
Right.
But that was her first response was,
Right.
I choose to forgive, you know?
Yeah.
In other words, why are you even bringing this up?
Hmm.
Why would you air this dirty laundry in front of everybody?
Right.
I'm a real Christian because I choose to forgive. And, we'll give him a chance to repent. Why is that the first response? Why isn't the first response, this guy raped multiple little children, right?
Right.
And we ought to be livid about that.
Yeah. We short circuit the first steps, which should be to be rightfully upset and righteously angry,
Yeah.
and to respond with accountability first and foremost. The first step in responding and providing accountability, like you said at the outset, taking action.
Yeah.
The first step is not that step of grace and forgiveness. That's just a common pitfall. You and I've seen it
Yeah.
over and over again.
Yeah.
And to me, your point goes to this idea that churches, we need a real culture shift in churches, because you're right. It's not just leaders,
Mm-hmm.
it's church members. We have to
Yeah.
really educate everyone in the church to understand that this abuse is not just a sin like other sins. It is a particularly horrific, egregious type of sin that does just incredible damage. And
And it's
that's
a crime. It's
and
a sin
and
and a crime.
and for child abuse, it's absolutely a crime.
Yeah.
So, and there are clergy abuse cases. We were talking about this earlier. More and more states, Texas, and then Tennessee, I think, is the latest one, where when a clergy member, even if it's not an assault, which would always be a crime, crosses a sexual boundary with a person in the congregation under their spiritual care, many states are starting to name that properly as a criminal act. And so the nomenclature in the church that we've used for years of the pastor having a moral failing, or having an affair with a congregant, More and more, even in those laws, as Christians, we have to name that properly. It's not an affair, it is clergy sexual abuse. So we have to have clear ways of talking about this, clear ways of training everyone and raising the education level really of everyone in the church, so that we don't get these responses that are so inadequate,
Yeah.
so damaging.
Yeah.
What are some other things that come to mind for you, Jimmy, when you think of, you know, how churches respond, common pitfalls, and ways that we respond to a victim's disclosure that are, you know, just really inadequate, or that you would want churches, like churches, pay attention.
Yeah.
Think about this dynamic. What are some of the things that come to mind?
Yeah, this is at the top of the list, the number one thing that I run into.
Yeah,
And this is from people who know my story.
right.
When I do trainings, when I consult with churches, when I talk to leaders, when push comes to shove, when there's a credible allegation,
Mhm.
and it includes one of their own,
Right.
one of their own ministers, one of their own, somebody on staff or a really close friend, a close peer. Um, the typical number one response is, but he's such a good man, and I just can't fathom him being capable of doing this. And uh, if if the person who alleges that he did these things, if that's true, even if it's true, I run the risk of getting fired from my job if I speak up, and they start naming all the personal losses that they're going to take. And you know what my response is? I used to kind of tiptoe around that. My response now is, if you want to make that argument to somebody, I'm probably not the person to be making that argument with, because I
Right.
lost almost everything, and I didn't care. I mean, of course I cared, but that's not what I was looking at. What I was looking at was, Jesus tells us we need to be willing to lay our lives down for the
Right.
innocent, for our brother and sister. And I told one gentleman, I said, he requires us. It doesn't suggest it. He requires us to lay our lives down, to be willing to lay our lives down for the innocent. You're not even willing to lay your job down.
Right.
It's this belief pattern that, um, I know this person. I've had people tell me, I've played golf with this guy for 20 years. Okay, so you can
Yeah.
swing a ball with somebody. So what?
Right.
That doesn't tell you who this guy really is.
Right.
And abusers are incredibly good at hiding their double life.
Yeah.
And when you start giving responses like that, where you're defending the person based on the character, based on your personal relationship, you've done what I call tipping the scales, right? You've tipped the scales in favor of the alleged abuser, because you're
Right.
saying, well, my relationship with this person outweighs a victim's credible allegations that he actually abused him or her in these
Right.
vicious ways. You're tipping
Right.
the scales in favor of the oppressor.
Right. And to me, it gets to this issue of, we have not taken to heart and applied Jesus's teaching very well.
Mm-mm.
He talked about this very dynamic, and it coheres incredibly well with what experts on abuse teach today. So Jesus's statement in Matthew 7, watch out for those false teachers who are like wolves in sheep's clothing, right? To paraphrase.
Yeah.
The same things experts would teach about basic abuse dynamics. Who are most abusers? Are they strangers? Oh, well, a few are.
Yeah.
Vast majority are known. The
Yeah.
vast majority are people within our families, within our neighborhoods, within our communities. They're people we know, people we trust.
Mm-hmm.
And the very reality of grooming, and grooming, of course, we think of it with child sexual predators. Grooming happens with many offenders. Clergy offenders groom when they abuse adults. Uh, when an abusive husband behind closed doors is abusing his wife. On Sunday, often there's a grooming that goes on within the community to have everyone in the community think of the abuser as a nice guy, as someone who would never do that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And there's an intentional manipulation and deception of the entire community. So given that reality of how grooming works, again, not just for child offenders, but for many types of predatory individuals, the the grooming that is taking place within the entire community, deceiving others, that is something Jesus taught.
Hmm.
We have to take that much more seriously. That gets back to our point that we have to, an effective path forward for every church has to be on some level, raising the training level, education level of the entire community. It cannot simply be a few key people, a few leaders. Leaders are critical,
Yeah.
but it cannot be. And look, what one thing I notice a lot, Jimmy, is we've mentioned things like, we could say there's a lot of myths that people in the church have bought into about abuse. There's a lot of denial. There's a lot of lack of education. There's often a failure of empathy, of being able to do what we discussed earlier, which is to put yourself in the shoes of someone who's been victimized, someone who's been rendered powerless in the abuse. That is, those are areas I see a lot. But one I see often is also when churches respond in certain ways is they confuse the church for a criminal court. They
Yeah.
they think, oh, well, when someone, especially if it involves abuse and that's a crime, we have to have due process. We have to think of them as innocent until proven guilty. We have
Hmm.
to have proof beyond a reasonable doubt. And if we don't have that in the church, we can't do anything about it. That's just, to me, a classic error, because the church is not a criminal courtroom. Those
Right.
standards, which are very high to hold someone accountable, apply in a criminal courtroom.
Yeah,
For the
I
reason,
can give you a
yeah,
case in point of what this looks like, because I
yeah, go
think,
ahead.
some people don't realize that it requires us to be harsh towards people, and
Yeah,
right, and
yep,
that's okay. Like Jesus was harsh towards certain people.
right.
Peter, if you ever read Second Peter chapter 2, my goodness, Peter comes unhinged, and these are towards sexual predators. Peter names who they are, what they're doing. They're preachers, they're false prophets, and Peter calls them, like, waterless mists. He calls them. He says the old proverb is true. The dog returns to its vomit and licks it up. Peter never has an ounce of grace or community, or we're just going to forgive you and bring you back in. Like, he names exactly what they're doing, and then he doubles, triples, and quadruples down on it. But
Mhm,
an example of what this looks like. We had a guy come into my congregation, that he was a visitor. I'd never seen him before,
mhm.
and he walked up to me, and he kind of half stuck his hand out, and then he took it back, and he goes, "I don't like shaking people's hands." I said, "Okay, um, good for you." And, like, this guy, just something about him when he walked in, I just it didn't sit right. Um, and then he started bad mouthing other pastors in town, and was just being really rude, being really offensive. And then he looked at me and he said, "I don't like you." And I knew what he was doing. The
Yeah,
guy was trying to get a reaction out of me
right, right.
and wanted me to coddle him. And, he was, I call it testing, right?
Yep, yep.
He was clearly testing me. So I just responded with, "Well, that's good, because I don't like you either." And it kind of caught him off guard. And,
Right.
and he looked at me. Well, then I was like, something about this guy, like, he kept looking over at one of my church members, a female church member. So I walked over to her, just you know, kind of hovered around her a little bit. And she pulled me aside and she said, "Can I talk to you a second?" "Absolutely, you can."
Yeah.
She said, "That man sitting there," she said, "this man has preyed on me sexually before, multiple times." She said, "He's very aggressive. He's tried to grope me. And she went through this whole thing. I was like,
Yeah.
good information to have. I went and I told my elders. They showed him the door
Yep. Absolutely.
and told him, "You're not welcome back here."
Yep.
That's what justice looks like. We didn't report him to the police because he hadn't broken any laws. Um, we, at least that we knew of.
Yeah.
Um, I don't know to what extent he did to this church member, but the elders talked to her later on in private.
Right.
Asked her if, and one was a former police officer. So, my point is, um, we have to be willing to protect people and
Mhm.
stop, quote unquote, protecting the church and saying, "Well, we're just going to be a place where everybody's welcome at all times, and we're not going to ask any questions."
Right.
That's a recipe for disaster. And
Yeah.
Jesus himself didn't do that.
Yeah. So that is a it's a great illustration of that. And I would say an abuse disclosure or any concerning behaviors like that, all of that requires response. None of that
Yeah.
is, well, oh, I can't, if I don't have, certain levels of evidence, or if I don't have,
Hmm.
no, no, no. Because the church is a community, and especially if you have a position of leadership, you have a responsibility for the safety of the community.
Yeah.
And if there's an abuse disclosure, if you have a situation like that with that kind of concerning behavior, interaction, or testimony of that's testimony of an allegation of assault, groping.
Yeah.
So when you have that in the church leaders have to, and everyone, but especially leaders, have to step up and be proactive.
Yeah.
And you have to draw lines of accountability and not wait until a criminal case plays out. Very
Right.
few cases end well in our current justice system for
Right.
abuse victims. And so if we waited for that, many survivors, many victims are never going to see accountability. The church can step into that with education, with training, and hold people accountable and
Hmm.
say, well, uh, and knowing not just the statistic on the low rates of false allegations, when there's a disclosure, it is just the case that there's a very low chance that that's a false allegation.
Yeah.
But leaving that aside, the seriousness of that disclosure leads us to step forward and draw boundaries and make sure
Yes.
that there is uh, doing all we can to limit access. Um, Let me just go into that a little more detail. Um, let's say a church leader reports a suspicion of abuse or a disclosure, and we don't know what law enforcement or CPS is going to do about it. And let's say it's someone who does work with kids in our church. How do we navigate that? Let's just talk through that kind of scenario. That might be helpful to people. Uh, because a lot of advocates will say, you don't immediately go, of course, and tell someone you've reported them. That can tip them off, that can
Hmm.
compromise a criminal investigation.
Hmm.
You don't also immediately go and tell the family of the victim, let's say, who disclosed the abuse. If you're not, especially if the offender might be in the house and you don't know that yet,
Right.
that can also lead to a compromising of a criminal investigation. So you have to be careful with that information.
And compromise safety of that child.
Yeah, and so there's a real tension there that churches sometimes face. We see this fairly often, where okay, let's say you've made a report, but now what do you do about accountability? And sometimes there's no exact clear answer, and you have to look at each case on a case by case basis. But give us a few thoughts, or what are some of the things you've seen in that regard that you would try to, just let churches know, hey, just be aware of
Yeah.
this,
Yeah,
that you
I
might
always tell
encounter
people,
this
I
dynamic.
always say there's this tension that we're constantly trying to hold between what's legally required of us,
Sure.
what's ethically required of us,
Hmm.
what's morally required of us, um, and then what actually works. You know, uh,
Hmm.
and 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 oftentimes what's you could meet the legal requirements, um, but some people do unethical things like go to the abuser and try to probe and say, well, did you really do this?
Right.
That's a major ethical breach. Major ethical breach. You just don't do that. You're not an investigator, one. Two, you're meddling in an investigation. You should never do that, or a potential investigation. um, and then what works, like ultimately, it's our responsibility to protect the innocent. And I've known of law enforcement during an active investigation where they tell church leaders, don't say anything to your congregation as long as this investigation is going on. I couldn't
Right.
disagree more. um, and that's one where I would, eh, unless there was a really good reason,
Yeah.
um, I would absolutely tell my congregation and tell that investigator,
Right.
I need to inform my congregation, because for all I know, families are putting their children in harm's way
Right.
because they don't know this guy's an alleged abuser. So yeah, there's always a balance that we carry. And in our case, it was pretty cut and dry because my dad was arrested 3 weeks after we reported him. But there was that 3-week period
Right.
where, I chose not to tell the congregation yet. Um, and I coordinated that with the detective, but I did tell them, I told a select group of people within the congregation during that 3-week period.
Mhm.
And then 2 days before his arrest, I told the congregation and had a written statement that I read to them. But during that 3-week period, I told my dad, under no terms are you ever to step foot inside of this church building, because he was telling me that he was going to show up to church.
Right.
And I said, I can guarantee you that if one of your feet steps foot over that threshold, I'm going to be the one to spin you around. And I said, it's going to be a scene that's going to be pretty ugly and you're going to be really embarrassed. I said, don't even try it.
Mhm.
And he didn't, but I had an obligation because I found out he had victims inside of the church um, that he was abusing up to the time of his arrest. Not a chance I was going to let him get anywhere near those victims. It wasn't happening.
Right. Sure. And I think that's so helpful. And what I would really impress upon church leaders is, yes, talk to the investigator if you can, talk to law enforcement if you can. Um, Impress upon them that this person is a part of your community and you have responsibility for the safety of your community, and see if you can communicate and reach out like you did to certain individuals who can
Yeah.
provide any level of accountability or provide any level of safety you can, as best you can, without compromising the investigation. So that's often, there's a real tension there. It's hard, but try to really seek answers. And you do not owe someone an answer to say, hey, you're not coming to serve with kids this week. We're just
Hmm.
gonna have a break. That in some instances, the best is just to say, we need you to step back for a season. And in talking with the investigator, it might not be, you might need to not share a reason why, or to share some other reason that doesn't get into the specifics.
Yeah, and I would
Yeah,
strongly urge to coordinate as best as you can with
yeah,
investigators. I mean, there's a small handful of investigators that I've heard of
yeah,
that they gave bad advice.
sure,
Don't tell anybody in the congregation.
yeah,
But I would say the vast majority of them
right,
are they want to
yeah,
work with you. They want to work with church leaders.
yeah.
Um, they're good at what they do, and coordinate with them.
And then
It's not that hard.
Yeah, and then once, if there are charges, if there is an arrest, then we would highly recommend, like you did, giving a public statement. And certainly,
Absolutely.
in cases where the perpetrator is an adult, not a minor, but that would have to be dealt with some nuance. But for an adult
Yeah.
offender, absolutely, you have to share, because there could be other victims. For the sake of even leaving that aside, there has to be a concern for safety. And if people don't have that information, parents, others cannot ensure accountability and safety without that information. So,
Yeah, and one of
sharing
the things
that's
that I
vital.
told my congregation in that statement too, Mike, is
Mhm.
I said, I've heard out of his mouth who some of the victims are.
Right,
He named names,
right,
but I said, unless you've been contacted directly by law enforcement at this point, assume that your children were not abused. But if you have any questions about it, go directly to the detective. And I gave her
right.
name, and I
Yes,
gave her information. I said, please don't
right.
hesitate to call her.
Absolutely.
That's what she's there for.
Great. So let's talk a little bit about responding to a victim in terms of ongoing care. Let's say after a disclosure, after a report's been made, what are some keys and essentials for churches to think about in terms of caring for a victim and, let's say, a victim's family even?
Yeah. First and foremost, transparency. Churches tend to be very secretive.
Mhm.
I've lost count of the number of churches that have these. I call them the devil agreements. The church leaders
Right.
call them covenant agreements. I call them devil agreements,
Right.
because they're typically a secret agreement between church leaders and registered sex offenders, where they go out of their way to not let the congregation know that there's a registered sex offender in the church.
Right.
Um, Transparency is vital. Let victims know what your policy is. If you
Mhm.
don't have a written policy, I would recommend, in our case, what we did, we didn't have a written policy. One of the first things I announced to the church is we're getting a written policy, so that this never happens again to the best of our
Right.
ability. Get educated, get trained, read books, preach sermons on abuse. Let them know that you're creating a culture that cares for survivors, and that turns away serial abusers.
Yeah.
Um, we are not going to open our doors. That's our specific theology, and we let our congregation know. If there's a serial abuser, the Bible says to correct oppression. We're correcting it by not allowing oppressors to be here. They've proved that they can't do it without perpetrating on
Yeah.
on young minor victims. So they're just not welcome here,
Sure.
and we don't apologize for that.
Absolutely. And then churches, to me, need to, of course, step up and provide that posture of belief, the posture of support, creating space for the expression of the really strong emotions, anger,
Yeah.
confusion, betrayal, grief, all sorts of
Yes.
things, instead of trying to squelch that and say, well, don't be angry, don't try to control the anger, the grief. That, this is actually all over the Bible as well, right? In the Psalms of Lament,
Mm-hmm.
no one's there in the Psalms of Lament saying, yeah, express this, but don't take it too far. No, it's just giving voice after voice of
Yeah.
expressions of grief, betrayal, anger. Often the context of those psalms is oppression of some kind,
Yes.
and there's many other settings as well. But for churches to, again, work on educating the entire church in that sort of relationship support that can be given within a church community is a beautiful thing, is a necessary thing.
Yeah.
And so for children specifically, or even adult victims, to recognize that churches have the ability to provide support and help in so many ways. And yet we always would say, when this is available and accessible, to look for really good trauma informed resources, whether that's, a trauma informed specialist who's a therapist or counselor who has
Yeah.
a lot of experience working with childhood abuse, or with adult victims of child abuse, looking to a child advocacy center if there's one area, to see if there are some qualified therapists or counselors who have this as a specialty, can really make the difference. And to me, that's never an either or.
Yeah.
A supportive church community is often vital to recovery. And at the same time, I do believe heartily in the expertise and wisdom of when available and accessible. And it's not always, and it's not available for everyone. I know that for sure. But that can be such a powerful tool of healing as well.
Yeah,
So
one of the things that we did, Mike, is we went to great lengths to protect anonymity of
yeah,
victims, to where I literally was the only person who knew who the victims were in the
right.
congregation. I was it, and my
Yeah.
wife. The parents of the victims knew that, and so we really, 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 really protected the anonymity of not only the victims but their families. At the same time, we offered to pay. It was like setting up a double blind system,
Hmm.
payment system. We offered to pay for counseling,
Yep.
for any of the victims, regardless of whether they needed the financial help or not.
Right.
And we said, for we set a period of time, um, and it was years, but we said, within this window, if any of my dad's victims need counseling, we will ensure that nobody knows who they are, and that counseling will be paid in full,
Yeah.
period.
That's so key because in the abuse, uh, the will of the victim's disregarded, their agency is taken away and violated.
Yeah.
And to give them empowerment, to me, that is a step that churches are should be taking that facilitate empowering victims, giving them agency, protecting their privacy instead of violating that privacy. It's so helpful to me. It's Dr. Diane Langberg's framework. This is in her book, On the Threshold of Hope, to just think about the ways abuse attacks our humanity
Hmm.
and to say for us to be a community or a person that facilitates healing and recovery, we have to understand those dynamics of how abuse directly attacks our will, our emotions, our bodies, and our agency and so forth, and seek to not, you can't fully undo that harm, but to respond by acknowledging the humanity, the dignity, and empowering victims. That is the mentality to me that is an environment that creates that sense of safety, that creates a sense of, hey, this is a place of refuge where someone can find healing and can be on a healing path and a healing journey.
I would say too, Mike, find out, people really need to listen. Sometimes we're
Mhm.
not good at
Yeah,
listening in
right.
the church, but they need to
Mhm.
listen to survivors and say what are some things that make you feel unsafe.
Right.
And in my dad's victims cases, that was just walking inside of that building.
Right.
For them, that was incredibly traumatizing.
Mhm.
And so my response was, go. Yeah, Jesus
Right.
told people often, go in peace. But you don't owe me any
Right.
sense of loyalty.
Right.
You're not going to offend me. You're not going to hurt me. Go in peace. Um, Find somewhere where you do feel safe, where there's not
Right.
all these recollections and all these memories and smells and
Mhm.
all that kind of stuff. Um,
Right.
I've known uh, some survivors, a lot of survivors really, who a touch on the shoulder is incredibly triggering for them.
Mhm.
Be really aware.
Right.
um, at our congregation, we keep our hands to ourselves,
Mhm.
because we just have a heightened awareness that we have a lot of survivors who are triggered by touch. um, Grabbing people and the
Right.
whole awkward, I always thought it was awkward, the just grabbing people and be like, hey, how can I pray for you today? um, that's invasive
Right.
for abuse survivors, especially if their abuser
Yeah.
prayed with them while they were abused. That happens really often.
Right.
Prayer can be traumatizing.
Sure.
So, just be aware of those kinds of dynamics and be sensitive to that.
Absolutely. That's really helpful. And if you need to step away from church and find a new church, find a church where the leaders understand that you have a hard time being in church and they're
Yeah.
totally understanding of that.
Yeah.
I think that's really critical. And if you're a church and certainly in leadership, understand why a survivor might not need to be in church every week, that might be hard for them, and pay attention. I think not just you said listening, that's so helpful. Also just watch body language, watch how someone in their body language that they might need something, that they might are giving off a signal that they don't feel safe, that they need a certain thing, and just ask if
Yeah.
appropriate without violating their privacy or asking invasive questions.
Hmm.
Absolutely. Okay, well, let's just do a couple more here, Jimmy. What about a let's just talk in general, and we've touched on several of these points, but let's just come back to this notion of some key responses for accountability, uh, for offenders when there's an accusation or disclosure, for the perpetrator in the wake of that disclosure and a subsequent report. um, just anything you want to summarize or challenge churches with.
Yeah. I mean, uh, credible allegations should be taken really seriously, right? Um, We call them credible um, because there's good evidence that the abuse could have happened. Not that it did happen, but it could have happened. That's a credible allegation. In the case of a credible allegation, or in our case, where I mean there was clear evidence, multiple victims came forward, and there was a confession very shortly after to the police. I mean that was pretty cut and dry. Um, we do a disservice to the victims and to the abuser if we give them access to the church, um, to other victims, to other potential victims. Um, that's not an act of grace. That's not an act of mercy. That to me is one of the most cruel acts, both to the innocent people and to the offender. That it's just a cruel act. Um, a kinder act, an act of grace that involves justice, is to say, look, we're keeping you away from children on every possible avenue that you could get access. That includes internet. If that means us calling the cable company, and of course, legally you can't do it, but hyperbole. If we have to call the cable company and cut your internet to your house, um, you need to prove that you're serious about getting yourself help. Um, you may or may not wind up in prison. Uh, that's out of our control. But what we can help control is that you really need help because you're perverted. Um, and we need to stop being afraid of using that language, right? You're a pervert. Um, your mind is really twisted because you didn't just think about doing these things. This isn't a heart issue. It's not like you lusted after little prepubescent innocent children. You actually followed through with it. You did it. You executed your plan multiple times with multiple victims. So you're a pervert. And you proved beyond the shadow of a doubt, regardless again of what the legal system says, in the end, you proved yourself that you can't be around innocent children without touching them in highly inappropriate ways and robbing them of their innocence and their honor. And, therefore, you proved you're the one who did this. You proved that you can't be around children, period. Um, so we just need to remember we need to turn it back on them because abusers are really good at flipping the script and saying, "Well, my goodness, I've been racked with guilt for all these years over what I did, and you know, I promise you I'm right with God now, and I've repented of my sins." They say it, but there are no fruits of that repentance. And we need to remember too, John the Baptist didn't tell people to repent. He said, "Bear fruit in keeping with your repentance." There's a radical difference.
Mm,
Um, so, we need to demand that of the abusers. Repentance is central to the gospel of Jesus Christ.
mhm. Thanks, Jimmy. Let's just close this with, we'll each leave churches listening with one practical step they can take. Just one key practical step. You go first, and then I'll share one, and then we'll close this out.
Okay. Yeah. I would say probably at the top of my list would be to read, 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 read.
Mm,
Um, there are a plethora of books on child abuse, blogs, podcasts, um, and there are more and more coming up every single day, and like quality stuff, free stuff.
mhm.
If you're a cheapskate and you don't want to spend $5 on a book, or if you can't afford it, because that's not really fair. Some people legitimately can't afford it.
Yep.
Uh, there are free sources out there. You can get a, a crash course on child abuse dynamics for completely free. Um, I would begin there. Start reading and consuming material and just really understand the dynamics of abuse and what that looks like and how you can respond well to it.
Great. And my practical advice would be, if you're in a church, speak to your leaders about your policy. If you are a leader, if you don't have a policy with clear response protocols, laying out some of these steps of caring for survivors, of drawing lines of accountability for those who have offended. Please make sure that that is something you get ahead of as much as possible. Don't wait. Seek out informed resources and put together a policy that is thorough and clear on these response protocols. Of course, as we mentioned, you have to pair that with training for the congregation to really have a policy that's lived and embraced well. You're going to have to pair that with the resources you mentioned, Jimmy, getting books, getting resources,
Yeah.
getting more informed and doing informed training. So let's just end by saying to everyone who's joined, thank you for taking this time to consider this important topic. As I said at the outset, these are complex issues that require a lot of care and thought, and it's hard. But I hope you're taking away some practical things from this that have been helpful. Jimmy, share with everyone where they can find more about you and your work, and then I'll close us out by sharing how people can find Grace as well.
Okay. Yeah. So the easiest way is just it's just my website. It's my name, or you can Google my name, and it'll land you on my website, jimmyhinton.org. We have Mom and I do a weekly podcast on all things child sexual abuse. It's called the Speaking Out on Sex Abuse podcast. Um, you can find that on the website. My book that came out in February, it's called The Devil Inside: How My Minister Father Molested Kids in Our Home and Church for Decades and How I Finally Stopped Them. You can find that on the website. And then I blog pretty regularly. And then, of course, there's a services tab where you can find out about trainings that I do and consultations. So,
Great. Thanks, Jimmy.
yep,
And then,
absolutely.
and just to remind everyone listening, if you haven't visited our website, and especially if you're with a church and you think, I might need some resources and help with either training or developing our policy, or let's say you're confronting a situation of response and you're not sure what to do, Grace provides services in all of those areas where we provide consultation to help churches confronting situations of response. We provide consultation to help develop policy and further policy. We provide various training options as well. So look for our website, seek out our website. It's www.netgrace.org. And then the final thing I'll say is that we understand that in the US, most churches are small and have very limited resources. And our heart at Grace is that every church would have more and more support in this area. And so one of the things we're planning on doing this coming fall is launching a fall fundraising campaign to really try to help smaller churches in this area be able to take advantage and utilize services such as these that we offer. We really do want to see every person in every church in an environment that's safe, where everyone's respected. So if you follow Grace, if you're aware of our ministry or support our ministry, just be looking for that. We'll have more details for that fall campaign in the next few weeks here. So thanks again, Jimmy. And thanks everyone who joined us. We're going to close it out, and we'll look forward to hopefully seeing you soon on the next Grace Live conversation.